On the 19th of April, 1883, a widow named Suno Kyun stood at the edge of Ward Spring holding a water pail no one would let her fill. The Cattlemen's Association controlled every drop of water in Cottonwood Basin, and Otis Bragg had gathered 11 ranchers to watch her turned away. Everyone assumed she would sell her dead husband's claim within the month and go back east on the next train. What Caleb Ward did instead, 3 months later, with a borrowed drill and a shovel of his own hands, would be spoken of in that basin for the rest of the century. Suno K had crossed an ocean believing a photograph and a letter, and had buried the man in that photograph 9 days after stepping off the train. Elias Hyun's claim was legally hers, 60 acres of dry grass and 1 collapsing soddy, but the water that made the land worth anything belonged to no one and everyone, governed by a vote she had never been allowed to cast. She learned the word unproved from Otis Bragg's mouth before she learned the names of her nearest neighbors, and she understood, standing in that dust with her pail swinging empty at her side, that dignity in this country would have to be dug for like everything else. Caleb Ward did not attend the meeting where the vote was taken, and when old Ferris told him of it that evening, mending harness by lamplight, Caleb said nothing for a long while. He had buried his own wife 3 years before, in a summer when the association had voted just as cleanly to deny her family water during a drought, and grief had taught him to recognize the particular shape of a door closing on someone with no one to open it for them. He rode out to the Hyun claim the next morning, not to offer comfort, which he did not trust himself to give, but to look at the land and see what the ground itself might still owe her. He found her kneeling in the dry garden bed behind the soddy turning soil that had not seen rain in 11 days, her sleeves pinned back and her braid bound with a faded ribbon the color of old rust. She did not stop working when his shadow crossed the ground beside her, and he did not offer his name first, only crouched and pressed his palm flat against the earth 2 feet from where she knelt, as if reading something in it she could not yet see. Neither of them spoke of the spring or the vote or the 11 men who had stood between her and the only water in the basin, but something had already begun that would take root long before either of them said it aloud. On the 3rd morning of April 1883, a picture bride named Suno Kyun stepped off the westbound railcar at Cottonwood Basin carrying a single wooden trunk and her mother's sewing needles hidden in its lining. The Cattlemen's Association that governed every drop of water in the basin held the only deeded spring for 40 miles, and every rancher on that platform already knew it. Everyone expected the Korean bride to vanish quietly into her husband's soddy and never trouble the ditch committee again. What happened instead, in the space of 9 days and then 11 more, would be argued over at that same platform for the rest of the decade. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only that the wind here smelled of dust and cattle instead of rice paddies and salt air, and that the man waiting for her beside a mule cart, hat in both hands, was thinner and older than the photograph he had sent her mother's cousin in Busan. His name was Elias Hyun, and he had left Korea as a boy on a mission boat and returned to it only in the letters he wrote asking for a wife who could read scripture and keep a garden. Suno K had read scripture. She had kept her grandmother's garden through 2 droughts and a flood, and she had told herself on the ship, and again on the 3 trains that carried her inland from San Francisco, that a garden was a garden anywhere in the world, so long as there was water to give it. Elias did not touch her hand when he helped her onto the cart seat. He only nodded, the way a man nods at a fence post he has finally gotten set straight, and said the ride to the claim was 2 hours if the creek crossing held. It held. The land, when they reached it, was 60 acres of buffalo grass and a low sod house with 1 window, and beyond the fence line to the north, a slope of green that did not match the brown of everything around it. Elias followed her eyes to it and said, that was Ward land, and the green held because of the spring on it, and the spring was not anyone's to share unless the association said so. Suno K asked, in the careful English she had practiced on the ship, whether their own 60 acres had water rights written into the claim. Elias said the papers were filed but not proved, that proving took a year of living on the land and working it, and that he had 8 months left to go. He said it plainly, the way a man reports weather, and she understood before he explained further that plain was simply how he spoke, not how he felt. That night he showed her the trunk of Bible tracts he had carried from the mission board, the ledger where he recorded rainfall in careful columns, and the corner of the soddy where she could hang the ribbon she had brought, if she wished. She hung it. It was the last color from home in a house made of dirt and grass roots, a thin strip of rust-red silk that had belonged to her mother's hanbok, and in the lamplight it looked, for one unguarded moment, like the first real thing she had touched since leaving the ship. The 9 days that followed were not unkind, only spare, the way the whole basin was spare. Elias rose before light to walk his fence lines and returned at dusk smelling of dust and horse sweat, and each evening he asked her, without much inflection, whether the garden bed she had broken behind the soddy was holding the water she carried to it. She told him it was, though the truth was harder than that. 2 miles to the Mudslow Creek and back, twice a day, her shoulders raw under the yoke of 2 tin buckets. The seedlings she had started from dried squash and bean seeds sewn into the trunk lining beside her mother's needles, struggling against soil that had not known irrigation since the last man tried to farm it. On the 7th night, Elias coughed through supper and did not finish it. On the 8th, he did not rise before light at all, and by midday his skin had gone the color of tallow, and his breath came in short pulls that frightened her more than anything had since the ship. She rode the mule 2 hours to town alone, her Korean and her English both failing her in the same breath when she reached the doctor's door, and returned with a bottle of quinine tincture that did nothing against a fever that had already gone past what quinine could touch. Elias Hyun died on the morning of the 9th day, 9 days after she had stepped off the train to marry him, and the last thing he said to her in the gray hour before he stopped speaking altogether was that the claim papers were in the trunk beneath the ledger, and that she should not let anyone tell her they were not real. She did not understand, in her grief, how much weight that sentence would carry. The county recorder in town was a tired, not unkind man who examined Elias Hyun's claim file for the better part of an hour before he told her, plainly, that the deed to the 60 acres passed to her as his lawful widow, the marriage recorded, the land recorded, both beyond question. What did not pass to her, he said, setting down his pen as though the next part pained him to speak aloud, was any share of the communal irrigation ditch or the water rights tied to Ward Spring, because those were not part of the original claim at all. They belonged to the Cattlemen's Association, granted by territorial charter, and the charter required a unanimous vote of every member rancher before any new claim, proved or not, could draw from the shared water. Elias had never finished proving the claim before he died, which left her land legally hers and legally dry, 60 acres of buffalo grass with a garden bed she had broken by hand, and no right, on paper, to keep it alive. The recorder told her, almost gently, that the association would meet within the week to decide the matter formally, and that she would do well to be there when they did. The Cattlemen's Association met on the 19th of April in the long room above the feed store in town. 11 ranchers on hard chairs around a table scarred by a decade of brand book disputes, and Sunok sat at the back on a bench meant for hired hands waiting on wages. She had worn her plainest dress and pinned her braid close to her head, the rust-red ribbon left at home in the trunk, because Elias had told her once that plainness brought a stranger less trouble than color did. Otis Bragg sat at the head of the table, a heavy-set man with a beard gone gray at the jaw and a voice pitched to carry without shouting, and he opened the meeting by reading the charter clause aloud, as though the 11 men in the room had not heard it 100 times before, that no claim, proved or unproved, drew water from the shared ditch or Ward Spring without the unanimous consent of the association's membership. He said the Hyun claim presented a plain question. The land had passed to the widow by law, no one disputed that, but the water rights had never been separate from the proving of the claim, and Elias Hyun had died 8 months short of proving anything. Bragg turned in his chair to look at her directly for the first time, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man reading a brand off a hide. He said she was, by every measure the association recognized, a stranger to the basin. No kin here, no standing here, married 9 days to a man who himself had barely finished proving his own claim to the territory, let alone the water. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Around the table, heads nodded slowly, the particular nod of men agreeing with something they had already decided before they sat down. One rancher, younger than the rest, opened his mouth as if to speak and then did not, his hand halfway to the table before he folded it back into his lap. Sunok understood perhaps 2 words in 5 of the fast cattle country English moving around that table, but she understood the shape of it perfectly well, the way she had understood the shape of arguments in rooms in Korea where she had not been asked to speak either. She kept her hands folded and her eyes level, because her mother had told her once that a bowed head could be mistaken for shame, and she carried no shame in this room, whatever these men decided to call her. Reverend Cyrus Doyle sat 2 chairs down from Bragg, the same man who had stood before Elias and Suno 9 days earlier, and pronounced them married under God and territorial law both, his Bible still faintly creased from the reading. When Bragg finished laying out the case against her standing, he turned to Doyle, almost as an afterthought, and asked whether the Reverend saw any obstacle in Scripture or conscience to the association's ruling. It was, Suno would understand only much later, the one moment in the room where a single voice might have turned the vote, because Doyle had blessed that marriage himself and knew better than any man present that it had been entered honestly, in good faith, before God and the recorder both. Doyle looked at his hands for a long moment. He said, at last, that the matter before them was a question of water and charter, not of marriage, and that he would not presume to advise the association on business that was rightly its own. It was not a lie exactly. It was the kind of true statement a careful man built specifically to avoid a harder one, and Suno watched something pass over his face as he said it, that she recognized from her own mirror in the weeks after Elias died, the particular stillness of a person choosing the easier silence. Bragg called the vote without further debate. 10 hands rose without hesitation. The 11th man, the young one who had almost spoken earlier, sat with his hands flat on the table and did not raise his against her, but did not raise it for her either, and no one in that room, then or ever after, put his name to that stillness in the minutes Bragg kept. The charter required unanimous consent to bar a claim from the water, a fact Suno did not yet know to question, and would not learn to question for months. Bragg gavelled the matter closed, and had the ruling posted that same afternoon on a plank nailed to the gate of Ward Spring itself, black paint on raw pine, declaring the Hyun claim unproved, and its water rights denied pending further proof of residency and improvement. Suno read the words 3 times before she understood all of them, standing alone at the gate in the late light with the green slope of Ward land rising cool and impossible behind the fence, and what she felt was not despair so much as a hard, clarifying anger that settled into her chest like a stone she would carry, unspoken, for a long time to come. She did not know, walking the 2 miles back to her dry 60 acres that evening, that one man in that room had chosen silence over a vote either way, or that his name would surface only much later, in a season none of them could yet see coming, when silence itself would no longer be enough to hide behind. The creek lay 2 miles east of the Soddy, down a slope of cracked clay and buffalo grass gone the color of old rope, and Sunok walked it twice a day with a yoke Elias had built for a stronger back than hers, 2 pails swinging at the ends of it and biting grooves into her shoulders that had not healed since the 2nd week. She had counted the trips without meaning to, the way a person counts anything that hurts. 41 steps to the first bend, the willow stump she used to judge how far she had left, the place where the bank crumbled soft underfoot, and she had to set the yoke down and go on her knees to fill the pails from water the color of weak tea. The garden took what the Soddy did not. She had marked the rows herself with string and stakes cut from a fence post Elias never got to raise, and she rationed the creek water between them with a discipline that felt, some mornings, like the only thing left standing between her and the dry Wyoming wind. Squash first, because squash forgave neglect. Then the beans, strung up a trellis of willow branches lashed with strips of her own petticoat when the twine ran out. Last the cabbages, which wanted more water than she could spare, and which she watched wilt a little more each week with a grief that surprised her in its size, given that they were only vegetables, given that she had buried a husband 9 days into a marriage and told herself she would not cry again over anything smaller than that. The sun by late April had lost its spring gentleness and taken on the flat white heat that the old-timers at the Mercantile said meant an early, hard summer, and she understood without being told that a woman who could not prove her claim would not survive a season that punished even the proven ones. She thought sometimes, hauling the yoke home in the copper light of early evening, of the plank nailed to the spring gate with its black paint gone slightly runny at the bottom of each letter, as though even the sign itself had wept a little in putting her out. She did not let herself think of Elias, most days. She let herself think instead of the shelf beneath the trunk lid where the ledger still lay, and beneath the ledger the ribbon her mother had tied into her hair on the morning she left Pusan, folded now into a square no bigger than a coin, kept where no one else's hands would find it. On the 9th day of dry weather, without a cloud crossing the basin, she was midway up the slope with the yoke cutting fresh grooves into old bruises, when a boy's voice called out from the fence line, high and careful, as though he had practiced the words before deciding to say them. The boy was small for his years and dark-eyed in a way that marked him as belonging fully to neither the ranch families nor the rail crews, and he stood at her fence with one hand resting on the top rail, as though he had been taught to ask permission with his body before his voice. He said his name was Sam, that he minded horses for the Ward outfit and for 2 others besides, and that he had seen her going down to the creek so many times he'd started counting the trips from the loft window where he slept. She did not ask why a boy would count another person's water trips. She only nodded, the way she had learned to nod at strangers in this country, a gesture that gave away nothing and asked for nothing, and set the yoke down to rest her shoulders, while he watched her with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, observed without being judged. He held out a strip of dried meat wrapped in a scrap of paper. Jerky, he said his mother had salted herself before the fever took her the winter before last, and when Sunok hesitated, he set it on the fence rail rather than push it toward her hand. Another small mercy she recognized because she had learned, in her own way, the same careful arithmetic of offering something to a person too proud or too frightened to simply take it. He warned her, before he left that first evening, that there was a rattler denned up somewhere along the creek bank near the willow stump, that Otis Bragg's own dog had been bitten there in June, and had lived only because Bragg shot the swelling leg off at the knee joint with a hatchet before the poison could climb higher, a story delivered with the flat relish particular to boys who have not yet learned to soften bad news for adults. She thanked him in English, still careful and formal, the words arranged like furniture in a room she had not yet made her own, and he grinned as though the formality amused him rather than put him off. And after that he came most evenings, never announced. Simply present at the fence with some small thing, a fish hook once, a twist of sugar wrapped in cloth another time, once nothing at all but the company of a boy who seemed to understand, without being told, that a woman alone on a dry claim needed to be seen by someone who did not want anything from her. It was on the 7th or 8th of these visits, the light gone long and gold and the cabbages drooping visibly in the last row, that Sam let slip, in the unguarded way of children repeating what has been asked of them without weighing why, that Mr. Ward had asked him, flat out, no explanation offered, exactly how many times a day the Korean woman walked to the creek and back, and whether the trips were getting longer or shorter as the weeks wore on, and Sam had answered honestly because he could see no reason not to, and only now, saying it aloud to her, did he seem to wonder for the first time what a man like Caleb Ward would want with such a small, exact accounting of another person's thirst. Old Ferris had worked the Ward outfit for 11 years, long enough to have carried Caleb's father to his grave, and long enough after that to have stood witness, close and silent, to everything that came next, and he was not a man who volunteered what he knew. It took Sunoke 3 visits to the Ward line camp, sent each time by Sam with some small errand about fence wire or a borrowed awl, before Ferris said anything to her beyond the weather, and even then it came sideways, offered while he worked a hamestrap with an awl, and did not look up, as though the words might not count as gossip if his eyes stayed on the leather. Ellen Ward had died 3 summers back, in a drought that had cracked the basin floor into plates a man could lose a boot heel in, and she had died the way women died, out here when the water ran short and the labor did not, in childbirth, in a summer so dry that even Ward Spring had dropped to a trickle, and the association of that year, Ferris said, with Otis Bragg newly risen to its head, had voted against opening the shared ditch to the Ward home place for emergency use, on the reasoning that Caleb's father had feuded with half the basin over a fence line 20 years before, and the debt, in their accounting, had never been settled. Ferris did not say whether the water would have saved her. He said only that the doctor had ridden 2 days from the county seat because the closer man was drunk, and that by the time he arrived, the well nearest the house had gone to mud, and that Caleb had spent the last hours of his wife's life hauling creek water in a washtub balanced on a travois because the wagon had thrown a wheel, and that none of it had been enough. Since that summer, Ferris said, Caleb Ward ran his ranch the way another man might serve out a sentence handed down by a judge only he could see. Competent, thorough, unfailingly correct in every dealing, and closed over like a door with the bar dropped from the inside. He did not attend dances. He did not court, though there had been women in the basin who would have had him gladly, cold reputation and all. He sat his seat on the association board and said little, voted with the majority more often than not, and Ferris had come, over 3 years, to understand this silence not as agreement, but as a man declining to spend himself on arguments he had already lost once in the way that mattered most. Sunok listened to all of this standing in the shade of the tack shed with a coil of borrowed wire over one shoulder, and she found that she recognized the shape of it, if not the particulars, a grief kept so carefully sealed that it had come to look, from the outside, like coldness, when in fact it was only a wound a man had decided no one else would be permitted to touch again. What Ferris did not say, that first long afternoon, was the thing Sunok pieced together only later, turning his words over on the walk back to her own dry acres, that the ban posted on her claim in April, unproved widow, unproved water right, carried inside it an old and exact echo of the vote that had refused Ellen Ward the ditch 3 summers before. The same board, largely the same men, the same reasoning dressed in new clothes, and that if Caleb Ward had noticed the echo he had given no sign of it in the meeting itself, sitting through Bragg's ruling with the same closed stillness he brought to everything else. It was weeks later, on a morning when Suno came again for a length of chain Sam said the foreman had offered to lend her, that Ferris let something slip he plainly had not meant to, the way a man will when a thought has been pressing at him too long to keep entirely still. He said that Caleb had ridden out twice in the last 10 days to the railroad camp on the far side of the basin, where a crew was laying track toward the county seat, and kept, among its equipment, a percussion drill rig heavy enough to bore a well shaft through rock that would break an ordinary post-hole auger in an afternoon. Ferris said Caleb had asked the foreman there, careful and roundabout, what it would cost to borrow such a rig for a week, and had not said for what purpose, and had told Ferris himself nothing beyond an instruction to have 2 horses ready and grain enough for a longer trip than a simple errand required. Ferris set down the length of chain he had been coiling and looked at her directly for the first time that morning, an old man's look, weighing something before he let it loose. He said he had known Caleb Ward since the boy was younger than Sam was now, had watched him bury a father and then a wife and close himself over both times like a door, and that in 11 years he had seen exactly 2 things pull the man toward action rather than endurance, his own kin, and now, it seemed, something else entirely, something Ferris was not fool enough to name aloud to the very person it most likely concerned. He would not say more than that. He picked the chain back up and went on coiling it as though the conversation had never opened, and when Sunoke asked, carefully, what a man might want with a railroad drill on land that was not his own, Ferris only shook his head once, sharp, and told her that some things a person had to be let arrive at in their own time, and that hers, he suspected, was coming faster than she knew, whether the association liked it or not. Caleb Ward came the first time on a Tuesday, riding the fence line that marked where Ward land met Hyun land, a boundary of 3 sagging wire strands that had not been walked by any Ward in over a year. Sunok saw him from the garden before she heard him, a shape breaking the flat gold of the afternoon, and she straightened with the hoe still in her hand and did not go toward the house for a shawl or a better dress, because there was no time, and because some instinct told her that changing herself for this man would only make the meeting stranger than it already was. He stopped his horse a respectful distance off, dismounted, and walked the last stretch on foot, leading the animal by its rein rather than riding up on her the way Otis Bragg had ridden up on the claim the day of the posting. He said he was checking the wire where their 2 properties joined, said it plainly, the way a man states a fact he expects no argument over, and then he crouched at the nearest post and tested the strand with 2 fingers as though the wire itself were the only reason he had come. Sunok watched him from 6 feet off and said nothing, because Elias had taught her, in the 9 days she had known him, that silence bought more than eagerness ever did on this land, and because she did not yet know what this man wanted beyond what he claimed. He worked the wire twice more, found nothing wrong with it that she could see, and then he stood and looked past her shoulder at the garden rows behind her, the beans climbing their sticks, the squash spreading low and stubborn against the dry wind, the corn that had come up thin but come up. He asked her, without preamble, how she was watering it. She told him the truth, that she carried it from the creek 2 miles off, a yoke and 2 pails, twice a day when the heat allowed and 3 times when it did not. He did not say that this was too far, or too much for one person, or express the kind of pity she had come to expect and refuse from the women at Bragg's store. He only nodded once, filed the fact away behind his eyes the way Ferris had once described him filing away a debt or a wrong, and asked whether the garden had wilted at all in the last dry week. She said the beans had, at midday, and recovered by evening. He nodded again. Then he touched the brim of his hat, the barest motion, and said he would be riding this line again before the month was out, since a man ought to know his own boundaries, and mounted and rode off the way he had come, without asking to see the house, without offering help he had not been asked to give, without a single word about the association or the ban or the plank nailed to his own spring gate not 4 miles distant. Suno-ko stood with the hoe in her hand and watched him go until the shape of him thinned into the shimmer of heat above the grass, and she found she could not decide whether she had just been visited by a neighbor performing a neighbor's duty, or by something else entirely, something that had not yet found the shape of its own name. He came again 8 days later, and then again a week after that, always with the same excuse of the fence, always dismounting before he reached her, rather than riding in close, always speaking in short, plain sentences that gave away nothing of what had brought him, and everything of what he noticed. He noticed that the bean rows had been restaked. He noticed that she had dug a second, shallower channel beside the first to catch what little rain fell and hold it a day longer in the soil. He noticed on the third visit that her hands had gone rough and cracked across the knuckles in a way that had nothing to do with sewing, and he looked at them once, briefly, and said nothing about it, though something in his jaw tightened as though he had bitten down on a word before it escaped. It was on the evening of that third visit, with the sun low enough to throw their shadows long across the rows, that he crouched again, not at the fence this time, but at the edge of her garden itself, and pressed his palm flat against the bare dirt between 2 rows, the way another man might test the temperature of a stove. He held it there a long moment. Suno-ko stood with the yoke still across her shoulders, pails empty now and swinging light, and watched him without asking what he was doing, because she had learned by then that a question would only earn her silence a moment longer while he decided how to answer it. When he finally spoke, he did not look up at her. He said that the ground beneath her garden ran on the same shelf of rock that fed his own well at the home place, a vein of stone that carried water sideways under the basin, the way a man might carry a secret sideways through a town, without ever speaking it aloud where the water itself showed on the surface. He said his grandfather had told him that once, tracing the shelf on a hand-drawn map long since lost, and that Ellen, he said the name plainly, without flinching, though it was the first time Suno-ko had heard anyone say it to her directly. Ellen had asked him once whether the shelf ran far enough to reach the far side of the creek, and he had told her he did not know, because in 3 years of owning that knowledge, he had never once had reason to test it. He stood then, brushing the dirt from his palm against his trouser leg, and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, something caught between calculation and a grief so old it had worn itself down to something almost gentle. He said only that he would be riding the fence line again soon, and that she should keep the garden watered as best she could until he did. He did not explain what the shelf of rock meant for her, or for the 60 acres, or for the days ahead, and he mounted and rode off before she could ask, leaving her standing in the failing light with the empty yoke across her shoulders and a name, Ellen, turning over slow and unexplained in her mind, while behind her, unseen from where she stood, a rider paused on the county road just long enough to mark the shape of Caleb Ward's horse tied at the hewn fence, and then rode on toward town without a word to anyone. Not yet. The railroad camp sat at the far eastern edge of the basin, a scatter of canvas tents and iron rails stacked in cords beside a graded bed that crawled another half-mile toward the county seat with each passing week, and it was there that Caleb Ward went a third time in as many weeks, not to ask after the drill rig now but to arrange for its loan outright. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Purdy who had dealt with ranchers before and knew the value of a favor banked against a lean season, listened to Caleb's offer without much surprise. Caleb did not offer coin, though he had it, because coin left a mark in a ledger somewhere, and a ledger could be read by anyone with a reason to look, and instead he offered labor, his own hands and 2 of his hired men, on loan to the rail crew for 2 weeks of grading and tie-laying, in trade for the percussion drill and a driver who knew its operation for however many days the boring required. Purdy weighed it, spat once into the dirt, and said he supposed a rancher's back was worth about the same as any other back so long as it didn't complain, and the trade was struck on a handshake with no paper drawn up at all, which suited Caleb precisely, since paper was the one thing in this arrangement he meant to avoid. He rode back to the home place that evening and told Ferris only that the rig would come in 3 days' time, and that he would need the wagon cleared and the team rested, and Ferris, who had asked no questions in 11 years that Caleb did not wish to answer, asked none now, though the look he gave the younger man carried the weight of a question all the same. When Sam Nakamura came by the stable the next morning to check the tack, Caleb found him there alone among the bridles and told him, in the same plain voice he used for everything, that he would need the boy to carry a message to the Hyun claim. Nothing written, nothing that could be repeated to anyone else, only that Sunoke should expect visitors at her land within the week, men and equipment both, and that she was not to be alarmed by the noise, and that she was to say nothing of it to anyone in town who might ask. Sam, who understood more than his 9 years generally let on, asked only whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that was coming, and Caleb considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant before he answered that it was meant to be a good thing, though he could not yet promise how it would end. The boy rode off at a gallop that only a child that age could sustain over 2 miles of open ground, and Caleb stood in the stable doorway a long moment after he had gone, watching the dust of his passage settle back into the grass, before he turned to the work of clearing the wagon bed for a rig that would arrive, by his own arrangement and his own 2 weeks of borrowed labor, without a single word of it ever reaching the Cattlemen's Association. The rig came at dawn 3 days later, hauled behind a borrowed team on a flatbed wagon that groaned under the iron weight of it, Purdy's driver at the reins, and 2 of Caleb's own hired men walking alongside to steady the load over the ruts of the county road. Caleb had told Sunoke only the evening before, riding out once more under his fence-line excuse, that the work would begin at first light and that she should keep clear of the machinery until the men had it set and steady, and she had asked him then, directly, what it was they meant to dig, and he had answered her as plainly as he answered everything: a well on her land, deep enough to clear the shelf of rock he had told her of, and strike the water that ran beneath it, so that she would never again need to ask the association's permission for a single pail. She had stood very still when he said it, the way a person stands when a sound comes from a direction they were not braced for, and she had asked why, and he had not answered that question at all, only mounted and ridden off into the dusk with the matter apparently settled in his own mind, whether or not it was settled in hers. Now, in the gray hour before true sunrise, she watched from the doorway of the soddy as the crew maneuvered the rig into place at the spot Caleb had marked 2 days prior, with a stake and a length of red cloth, a spot he had chosen, he told Ferris privately, not by guesswork, but by the old shelf line his grandfather had once drawn, walked and re-walked on foot until he was certain of the ground beneath it. Caleb worked alongside the hired men and Purdy's driver without distinction of rank, his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back, hauling chain and bracing timber with the same flat competence he brought to every other labor of the ranch. And if the work cost him something beyond sweat, and Ferris, watching from a distance with the wagon team, believed that it did, he gave no sign of it to the men around him. The percussion bit began its work as the sun cleared the ridgeline, a slow, heavy, rhythmic strike that carried across the flat ground for the better part of a mile, and Sunoke stood in her doorway and listened to it as though it were a language she had not yet learned to read, unable to say whether the sound she felt building in her chest was fear or something nearer to hope. She did not go out to the men, understanding without being told that this was not yet her labor to share, but she watched Caleb Ward move among the rig and the timber and the borrowed team with the same silent, unexplained purpose he had carried onto her land 3 times now. A man digging towards something buried far deeper than water, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly it was he meant to unearth before the digging was done, a question that would have to wait, because before the sun had climbed much higher, a second rider appeared on the county road, moving fast, and Otis Bragg reined in at the fence line just as the drill crew broke for their midday meal, his face already dark with the question he had ridden 2 miles to ask. Otis Bragg swung down from his horse before the animal had fully stopped, and the dust he raised drifted across the fence wire and settled on Caleb's boots as he stood waiting, unmoved, one hand resting on a coil of rope. Behind him, the drill crew wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands and watched without watching, the particular skill of hired men who knew when a conversation was not theirs to join. Bragg did not waste time on greeting. He said Caleb Ward had some explaining to do, standing on land that had no water rights and putting a rig on it as though the association's vote from April meant nothing at all. Caleb let the accusation sit in the air a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried the same flatness he used on a spooked horse, low and even, meant to calm rather than provoke. He said the vote concerned the spring and the ditch, and this well drew from neither. Bragg's jaw worked. He said it was the principle of the thing, that a woman with no proved claim could not be seen digging in defiance of men who had built this basin with their own hands, and that Caleb of all people ought to remember what defiance of the association had cost families before. The words landed exactly where Bragg meant them to land, close enough to Ellen's memory that even the hired men glanced away, and Caleb's hand tightened once on the rope coil before it went still again. He said he remembered it better than any man standing at this fence, and that memory was precisely why he was here. Martha Bragg had ridden out with her brother-in-law, uninvited by either man, and she sat her horse a little apart from the two of them, her gloved hands folded over the pommel, her face unreadable in the way of a woman long practiced at giving nothing away in company. She had not spoken since dismounting. She watched Caleb the way a person watches weather building on a ridge, trying to read whether it would pass wide or come straight down the valley, and something in his stillness, the deliberate, unhurried way he held himself against Otis Bragg's temper, did not match the picture of him she had carried since April, a picture built entirely out of what her brother-in-law said about him at supper tables. Bragg pressed further, asking by what right Caleb thought he could simply overturn a matter the whole association had settled by vote, unanimous and proper, recorded in the minutes for any man to read. And it was here that Caleb's answer changed shape, no longer defending the well at all, but turning the conversation toward the vote itself, quiet and precise as a man laying a card face up on a table he had been studying for weeks. He told Otis Bragg, plainly and without heat, that he had spent the better part of 2 weeks going back through the ledger the association kept of its meetings, starting with the April minutes and working backward through the 3 years before them, because a man digging a well ought to know exactly what he was digging around. Bragg's face did not change at first, the way a man's face does not change when he has not yet understood what is being said to him. Caleb went on, saying that a charter required unanimous consent to bar any claim from the communal water, that he had read the clause himself in the copy kept at the land office, and that he intended to make certain the April vote had actually been unanimous before he let the matter rest. The stillness that followed was not the stillness of two men finished talking, it was the stillness of one man realizing the ground under the conversation had shifted without his noticing the exact moment it happened. Bragg said too quickly that the vote had been proper, that he himself had counted the hands, and Caleb answered only that he was sure Bragg believed that, his tone giving away nothing of what he had already begun to suspect, though Ferris would learn the shape of it that same night. Martha shifted in her saddle, a small motion, barely a settling of weight from one hip to the other, but her eyes had moved from Caleb to her brother-in-law and stayed there a beat longer than courtesy required. She had ridden out expecting to watch a rancher be put in his place for meddling in a widow's affairs that were none of his business, and instead she was watching Otis Bragg's certainty falter in real time, a small crack opening in a man she had spent 3 years believing infallible on matters of the association's authority. She said nothing. It was not yet her place to say anything, and she had not decided, sitting there in the dust with the fence wire humming faintly in the wind, whose side of this she actually stood on. Bragg recovered himself enough to say the matter was settled and posted, and no ledger quibble would change what the association had already ruled, and he turned his horse hard enough to make the animal toss its head, riding back toward the county road without waiting to see whether Martha followed. She lingered a moment longer, her gaze passing once over the drill rig, once over the raw earth already piled beside the stake and red cloth, and once, last of all, over Caleb's face, before she turned her own horse and rode after him, leaving Caleb standing at the fence with the certainty, unspoken to anyone but himself, that he had found the first loose thread in a rope the association had always claimed was whole. That night, Caleb sat at the plank table in the ward kitchen with the association's ledger open under a single lamp, old Ferris across from him with his pipe unlit in his hand, the two of them working through the April minutes line by line the way a man reads a contract he suspects has cheated him. Caleb had told Ferris only that something in the record did not sit right, and Ferris, who had learned over 11 years not to press Caleb Ward for more than he was ready to give, had simply pulled up a chair and waited. The minutes recorded 11 names beneath the resolution barring the Hyun claim from communal water, each signature witnessed by Reverend Doyle's looping hand at the bottom of the page, and the vote was noted as unanimous. No abstentions, no dissent. But Caleb had ridden past Doyle's parsonage that afternoon on his way home from the fence line, not by accident, and asked the Reverend, gently enough that it did not sound like an accusation, whether he recalled every man in that room raising his hand. Doyle had gone quiet in a way that told Caleb more than any answer could have, and after a long moment the Reverend admitted, reluctantly, that he recalled one seat empty for a portion of the meeting, a rancher named Whitfield who kept land on the basin's eastern edge, and who Doyle believed had left early to see to a sick horse. Caleb ran his finger down the ledger now to Whitfield's name and the signature beside it, small and cramped, nothing like the bold hand Whitfield used on every bill of sale Caleb had ever witnessed at the stockyard. Ferris leaned in over the lamp and studied it a long moment, then said, quiet, that he had seen Whitfield's mark 100 times buying and selling cattle, and this was not it. Caleb said he intended to find out where Whitfield actually was on the 19th of April, and Ferris, setting his cold pipe down on the table, said he already knew, because Whitfield had stopped at the Ward Ranch that very week on his way home from Laramie, 50 miles east, where he had gone to buy 3 head of breeding stock, a trip Ferris remembered because he had helped unload the cattle himself. The two men sat with that fact between them a while, the lamp burning low, neither of them saying aloud what it meant, because saying it aloud would make it a thing that had to be acted on. 3 days later, the drill crew broke through a seam of wet shale at 41 feet, and the sound that came up out of the earth was different from anything the bit had struck before. A hollow, echoing knock followed by a rush of air and then, unmistakably, the slap of water against stone far below. The driller shouted for the others to stand clear, and Caleb was already moving before the words finished leaving the man's mouth, dropping to his knees at the wellhead with his hat gone somewhere behind him, listening the way he had listened for Ellen's breathing in her last hours, every part of him fixed on a single sound. When the bucket came up dripping and cold and clean, he held it a long moment without drinking, without speaking, only looking down into the water as though it might tell him something the ledger had not. Suno came from the garden at a run, her apron still gathered in one fist, and stopped a few feet off, watching Caleb kneel there with the bucket between his hands. And for the first time since the digging began, she saw something in his face that was not the flat, guarded competence he wore like a second skin. It was closer to grief than to joy, though the water was plainly good, sweet even, and the men around him were already laughing and slapping each other's shoulders in the rough, relieved way of men who had spent weeks unsure whether the ground would give them anything at all. She understood, without being told, that this well answered a question that had nothing to do with her garden. Caleb rose finally and handed her the bucket himself, his hand steady, and said only that the water was hers now, drawn from her own ground, owing nothing to any ditch or any vote the association had ever taken or would take again. It should have been the end of the trouble. The association's ban, whatever its legality, no longer had any power over a well that answered to no shared line. And Caleb could have let the matter rest there, let the water itself be the quiet, sufficient answer to Otis Bragg and the plank posted at the spring gate. But that night, back at the ranch with Ferris and the forged signature still lying open on the table between them, Caleb understood that the well solved Sunoke's thirst and left the larger wound entirely untouched, the same wound that had opened 3 years before, when a vote just like this one had cost him Ellen. And he sat a long while in the lamp's failing light turning over a decision that had nothing to do with water at all, whether to let the new well quietly make the ban irrelevant, sparing men he had ridden beside for a decade, or to carry the ledger and Whitfield's true whereabouts into the full light of the Grange Hall and let every one of them answer for what the forged page had done. The notice went up on the Grange Hall door on a Tuesday, nailed by Caleb's own hand, calling every member of the Cottonwood Basin Cattlemen's Association to a full meeting on the following Saturday evening, business stated plainly as a review of the April vote barring the Hyun claim from communal water. Word carried faster than the notice itself. By Wednesday, every ranch in the basin knew Caleb Ward had called the meeting, and by Thursday most of them guessed why, though none said it aloud where Otis Bragg might hear. Sunoke heard it from Sam, who heard it from a hand at the livery, and she carried the knowledge through 2 days of ordinary work, weeding, drawing water from her own well, mending a seam in the trunk's lining where her mother's needles rode, without letting it change the shape of her hours. She had learned that much in 5 months on this ground, that waiting badly cost as much as waiting well, and only one of the two left a woman with anything to show for the wait. Caleb rode out once more before Saturday, not at dusk this time but at midday, in full sun, so that anyone on the county road could see exactly whose fence he checked and how long he stayed. He told her what he meant to do, laying it out with the same flat economy he used for everything: the ledger page, Doyle's memory of the empty chair, Ferris's account of Whitfield unloading cattle 50 miles from where his signature said he'd been. He did not ask her permission, and she understood that he was not asking it because the meeting was not, in the end, about her water. It was about Ellen Ward, 3 years dead, and a vote that had cost him everything before Sunoke ever stepped off a train. She told him this once, plainly, watching his face for the flinch she expected and did not get. He only nodded, once, as if she had named a debt correctly, and said that a man could carry a wrong a long while before he found the strength to set it down in front of witnesses. Saturday came in with a hard blue sky and a wind that smelled of cut hay. Sunoke, dressed in her plainest clothes from habit, then stood a long moment over the trunk before lifting the ribbon from its cloth and tying it, for the first time since the day of the April vote, into her braid. She did not examine the decision closely. It simply felt, that morning, like a day to stop asking plainness to buy her safety. The Grange Hall filled past its benches by 7, ranchers standing along the walls with hats in hand. Wives and grown children crowded near the door where the evening air still moved. Otis Bragg took his customary chair at the head table as if the meeting were his to run, and for the first several minutes it nearly was, opening with a review of ditch maintenance and a dispute over a strayed bull, ordinary business meant to remind the room where authority sat. Caleb waded through all of it without moving from his place near the side wall, and when the ordinary business ran dry he simply rose, and the room quieted the way a room quiets when it has been waiting all along for the true reason it came. He did not raise his voice. He laid the association's ledger open on the table where every man could see the page, and beside it a second sheet in Reverend Doyle's careful hand, and he asked the Reverend, seated near the front, to stand and say what he remembered of the chair that had sat empty through part of the April meeting. Doyle rose slowly, older in that moment than his years, and told the room what he had told Caleb in private, that Whitfield's seat had gone unfilled that evening, that he'd assumed a sick horse and thought no more of it until a signature turned up beside Whitfield's name in a hand too small and cramped to be his own. Ferris spoke next, unprompted, from where he stood by the door, and said plainly that he'd helped Whitfield unload 3 head of breeding stock at the Ward Corral the very week of the vote, off a wagon fresh from Laramie, 50 miles east, and that no man drives 50 miles and casts a vote on the same afternoon. Otis Bragg came half out of his chair, color rising in his face, and said the ledger was the association's business and no ranchers to go picking through uninvited. But the words came out thinner than he meant them, and the room had already begun to lean away from him, the way a herd leans from a man who has lost the scent of his own authority. Martha Bragg, seated near the back beside 2 other ranch wives, did not look at her brother-in-law. She looked instead at the ledger page, and then, briefly, toward the door where Sunoke stood with the ribbon bright in her dark hair, and something crossed her face that had not been there in April. Not yet sympathy, but no longer certainty either, a woman's first honest doubt about a thing she had once called settled. The vote to strip Otis Bragg of his seat took less time than the vote in April ever had. No unanimous consent required for a matter of the association's own charter, only a show of hands among men who had heard a forged signature named aloud and watched the man who forged it fail to deny it outright. Bragg left the hall before the count finished, his boots loud on the plank floor in a silence that said more than the vote itself, and no one moved to stop him or soften the walk. It was Martha who moved instead, rising from her bench once the door had shut behind him, crossing the width of the hall past neighbors who watched her go without a word until she stood at Sunoke's side near the back wall. She said only that she was sorry, plain as that, no ornament to it, and Sunoke answered with a small nod that asked for nothing further, because there was nothing further owed between them that an apology in a crowded hall could settle, only years, maybe, of small ordinary kindnesses that would have to stand in for the ones withheld. The association elected a new head that same night, an older rancher named Colcord who had abstained from the April vote and never signed his name to Bragg's minutes at all, and the first business he conducted was a motion to strike the ban from the record and rewrite the charter so that no vote on water or standing could pass again without every hand raised in open daylight, recorded by 2 witnesses rather than one man's pen. The charter change took a week of drafting and another association meeting to ratify, dry work compared to the drama of the first, but Sunoke understood by then that dry work was often what safety was actually made of, not a single dramatic reversal, but the slow, unglamorous rewriting of rules so the reversal would not need repeating. Through the last weeks of September and into October, she watched her garden answer the well the way a plant answers rain it has waited months for, the rows thickening, the soil holding moisture longer than it ever had from the creek's rationed bucketfuls. She drew water each morning without calculation now, without counting trips or measuring against a day's ration, and the freedom of that, of simply drawing what she needed and returning to her work, settled into her slowly, the way a held breath settles once a person forgets, for whole minutes at a stretch, that she had ever been holding it. Caleb came to the Hyun claim now without the pretext of fences, riding over most evenings once his own chores were done, and the two of them fell into the kind of quiet that neither hurried to fill, sitting on the step of the soddy while the light went copper and then gray over the basin. He told her, one such evening in October, that he'd spoken with Ferris about moving his cattle operations water draw entirely off the association's ditch within 2 years, using what he'd learned of the rock shelf to sink a second well on ward land, so that no vote of any board could ever again decide whether his own family drank. Sunok understood, hearing it, that this was as close as Caleb came to speaking of Ellen without saying her name outright, and she let the words stand without pressing him toward the ones he withheld. They married in November, in the same Grange Hall that had held the vote against her and the meeting that undid it, Reverend Doyle presiding with a steadiness in his voice that had not been there in April, as if the confession he'd made before the association had settled something in him too. It was a small gathering, Ferris and Sam and Martha among the few who stood witness, no crowd of 300, no dress passed down in mockery, only a plain blue dress Sunok had sewn herself with her mother's needles, and the ribbon, worn openly now, tied once more into her braid. There was no grand pronouncement at the ceremony, no speech about wrongs righted, because both of them had learned by then that the water itself had already said what needed saying, drawn fresh from ground that answered to no one's permission. On a cold, clear morning in late November, weeks after the wedding, Sunok knelt at the well's edge before full light, breath showing pale in the air, and lowered the tin pail on its rope until it struck water, and pulled it up brimming, the mother's ribbon she'd tied loosely around the handle catching what little dawn there was. Across the yard, Caleb worked at the fence line, splitting rails with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, not looking up, not needing to, because the sound of the pail striking water and the sight of her kneeling there had become, in the ordinary accumulation of months, simply the sound and sight of a morning beginning, two people working in the same unhurried silence as any couple long enough married to have stopped counting the mornings, and to have started, instead, simply living them.